Hi everyone, today we're going to talk about layers of nature, so that's double exposures and amalgam of form. In the first slide you can see an image by Tomasso, who I introduced to you in a previous presentation when we were talking about paired imagery. And I spoke then about this idea that through layering images, what we might be able to create is a sense that we are no longer separate to the thing that we photograph, and in this case it's nature. I want us to think very carefully about this particular photograph being a male figure, a portrait photograph, who seems to be in some kind of turmoil. And interestingly, the photograph the portrait is amalgamed with is one of a tree. Very simple, branches of a tree. But to me, those branches really do represent something about the lifeblood of humanity. So there's maybe some kind of environmental message in this image where we're looking at someone who's holding his head perhaps in shame or in anguish of some sort, and we are reminded of the natural world, the living world in which we live. And this is a theme that we keep returning to time and time again. If I remind you, if you're in my Year 9 class, you're one of my students at school, then we're thinking about a sense of place with our overarching theme being nature. I think for most of us, we have a very strong identification with the natural environments that we are used to as we grow up. And even if we come from a city, perhaps we have memories of places where we visited in nature, kind of rural setting or somewhere that's far flung or remote. And those places of nature really do tend to stick in our minds. We return again and again to the environmental themes of our own devastation or the destruction that we create. I don't even know if that's an oxymoron. Can we create destruction or devastation? We do. We do it to our planet all the time. These photographers, even going way back to someone like Keith Dotson, is drawing our attention to, of course, the beauty of our nature, of our land. But they're also, I think, asking us to question what we are doing about our behaviour towards nature. Okay, so Tomasso, he's Italian, he's a living artist. There's some stuff online about him. It seems to be Instagram that is the main forum for his work. There's lots of stuff that's not in this double exposure style, but I do really enjoy looking at these double exposures, especially this one where we see the ocean and it is layered with a side view portrait. I find it interesting that in Proetti's case, he's illuminated his model, which I think is him actually, it's a self-portrait, so that we have a very stark kind of bleaching out or blanching out on the forehead and the nose. And we then have those beautiful undulating ripples of the water that we see, and that is in colour, where otherwise we might perceive this to be a black and white photograph. So the portrait is in black and white, but the ocean, the nature, remains in colour. And I wonder what that means, if it means anything at all. And I'd like you to think about that, as if we have a human form that is in black and white, yet we have the natural form in colour. Could there be a hidden message there, a meaning? To me, perhaps it says that there's an additional vibrancy to something in the natural world or naturally occurring that has a longer lifespan than us, maybe, that there's an element of the infinite, that nature surpasses the human, or something to do with our paling by comparison to the nature that surrounds us. But because that nature is contained within the shape of the man, it does suggest to me that we're not separate from nature, that nature actually makes us up. And double exposure is a very kind of traditional technique. It's a trick almost. Pioneers of photography would have used it to showcase their wizardry in the darkroom, or indeed in camera. And I've just got some examples on the screen just now. Sarah K. Byrne, she's a living artist, experimenting there, not just within the contained shape of the silhouetted human form, but allowing that human form to sort of dissolve out into the shape of the trees that she's used in the double exposure. You've got Man Ray, the surrealist photographer, very, very famous pioneer of photography. Harry Callahan, another American. Interestingly, these three examples are all of women. I wonder if that's to do with it being Mother Nature as a kind of overarching theme, that we tend to refer to nature or think of nature as female or feminine. And then the last one above me, you can see there, Charles Swedland. A lot of these photographers are people who not only have influenced each other, but influence the photographer I really want to talk to you about today. And that's Christoffer Relander from Finland. Now, immediately I think you'll be able to see the commonality between he and Byrne on the previous slide. But there are, of course, also similarities between him and Proietti. Although in his case, what he's doing is he's allowing again this sense that nature isn't just contained within the human, but that nature grows from the human, or that the human is very much created from nature somehow. I think it's got a beautiful, delicate quality. Similar to Proietti, he's got very harsh light. The illumination on the lips, the chin, suggests that we have directional light coming from the side of the face. But that sort of dissolving away into nature is very beautiful. It's very poetic seeming. Christoffer Relander has got a brilliant website. If you have a chance to go and have a look at what he does. He's not formally trained as a photographer, but he does strike me as somebody who's obsessively studied photography in his own time. There's lots of biographical information about him being part of the Finnish military, and during that time developing a keen interest in photography. He's working now. I think he must be in his early 30s. He has a young family, as far as I can tell. But his fascination with photography is really centred on double exposure, where, of course, you can have more than one image within the frame. And those images, in his case, have their own meanings individually, but of course, together, they create something quite spectacular. And the meaning is then enmeshed. It's really, really rooted down in what he's choosing to show us. He grew up in the south of Finland, just outside of Helsinki. A beautiful landscape. And there's lots of stuff about him that says that he always returns in his mind and his memories to that landscape. He said himself there, reality can be beautiful, but the surreal often absorbs me. Photography to me is a way to express and stimulate my imagination. Nature is simply the world. With alternative and experimental camera techniques, I am able to create artworks that otherwise only would be possible through painting or digital manipulation in an external software. So he's making most of his work in camera, that seems to imply. And looking at the image I've got here on the screen, the child with the butterfly, we're back to something that's contained within a silhouetted form. And if we're going to pare back to the kind of basics, the technical basics of this, and just think about also technical language, I would like you to use words like silhouette. I would like you to think very much about composition, where he's positioned the girl within the frame, the fact that we have a side view so that we can see very clearly the features of the girl's face without actually seeing what's in that centre part that's eclipsed by the butterfly, by the nature, those ferns growing. And all the time thinking again back to meanings, like why are we looking at this in this way? Why has the photographer chosen to present these things in such a sort of visual dynamic? To me, very much straight away, I'm thinking about childhood, I'm thinking about memory. I'm looking at a butterfly and I'm thinking about the lifespan of a butterfly. Such a fleeting amount of time for something so extraordinarily beautiful. And is that perhaps a comment from the photographer about childhood, but also about the nature we hold kind of in this stasis in our memories from our childhoods? I mean, I know myself when I think back to growing up in Scotland, The memories I have of landscape and of nature are really profound. They have a profound impact on how I operate now as an adult and how I respond to nature now, even down here in the south of England. But when I think about it, time is compressed. The sense of nature is not compressed in my memory. It's still as expansive as it has always been. There's a quote here by Muriel Guipin. She's a gallerist in New York. She stalks Relander's work in her gallery. She says, Finnish photographer Christoffer Relander's We Are Nature series blurs the line between the natural world and the human form to such a degree that it is impossible to tell where one ends and the other begins. In doing so, he has not only produced a set of stunning visual images, but also a reminder of the very real universal truth that indeed everything is connected at the deepest of levels. That sums it up, really. I'm not sure what else I could say about it. Of course, when Guipin is writing about Relander's work, she's writing the kind of the summary of what he does for her buyers, the people who come to her gallery and buy his work. But I think just contextually for us as students of what he makes, it's very interesting to read somebody else identifying so clearly that universal truth, indeed everything is connected at the deepest of levels. That's talking to me very much about how humans and nature are not separate again. Now, the technical qualities of double exposure can be achieved in camera. I mean, it used to happen all the time with film photography where accidentally your film wouldn't wind on in the camera and two images would be exposed on the same piece of film in the same negative space. You can achieve it also in the darkroom if you're using traditional photographic techniques, and if you're a student of mine, perhaps when we get a chance to be back in school and back in the darkroom, we'll have a look at this together. But I think for most photographers working now, double exposure is something that is achieved mainly through digital manipulation. And there are lots of ways we can do that. There are lots of tools we can use. I think on iPhone, you can use something like Image Blender. It's very cheap to buy that app. If you're using Android, I think it's called Vignette. You can use that to layer up images and also kind of scratch away or erase away segments of the image, much like Relander is doing, where he diffuses the face into the leaves at the back. And if you are working digitally and you have the benefit or the luxury of working with Lightroom and having Photoshop, for example, if you want to create the illusion of double exposure, you're going to be using tools like overlay and blend. You're going to be looking for commands like opacity and, of course, transparency, where you are quite simply layering one image on top of another. Now, the skill in that comes if you want to perhaps isolate a silhouetted shape, or if you want to diffuse into another shape, as I said with Relander's work, where we go into the leaf space of the tree, the canopy of the tree, from the lady's face. That, of course, takes a lot of skill to try and isolate those forms and very softly move us from one space or shape through the transition of really just tone in photographs into another shape and space altogether. And I'm coming back to Proietti for this. I think for our purposes as students, the easiest way we're going to tackle this as an experiment ourselves is to think primarily about isolating a silhouette shape. So in Proietti's work, mainly we're looking at a human form, a figure form, that is then a silhouetted space inside which nature operates. I think there's also beautiful qualities here in terms of translucency, not just transparency, where we don't have really garish colours. There's something very subtle, very soft and very beautiful. And thinking also then about how the body is illuminated. We have that directional light again, especially on the larger figure on the slide just now, that's hitting the back of the body. So that even on the branches, we create the same tonality. So the branches on the furthest back element of that body are also kind of bleached away as well. Again, bringing it all together, making things that are layered and two separate things seem as if they are one, that they belong to each other, that they are not separate or split apart in any way. And so your task this week is to create a series of digital double exposures using portrait photographs overlaid with images of nature. I want you to analyse the work of Christoffer Relander, comparing his work to that of Tomasso, Victoria Steponi and Alicia Brodovic from our past presentations. And I want you to present your work as a PowerPoint, including your initial shots, so that is before you manipulate them, so just your raw images. And I want you to also show, of course, the selected images that you then are going to pair together, and of course then the paired images, or rather the layered images that are your final outcomes. And for stretch and challenge, you're going to experiment with diffusing the human form into the shapes of nature in the style of Christoffer Relander. And if you want a reminder of that as a difference, you can see on the screen now a Proietti image where the shape of nature, the tree, the landscape is contained within the silhouetted form of the figure with his back turned to us. And with Relander, what we see again a silhouetted form, a female form, but this time at the top of her head we start to diffuse out into nature. So we no longer really have purchase on the human. The human becomes almost like every human, and every human disperses somehow into nature. I mean, of course, that could be a comment on life in general, life and death, that we go back to earth, we go back to land, to nature. And just one more thing before I move on, I meant to mention this. If you look at Relander's website, there's a really excellent film of him making his work. There's also this work, is called Jarred and Displaced, I think, where he's taken Finnish landscapes and he's quite literally jarred them. He's kept them in these bell jars. He wants us to understand that nature is kind of taken almost into his heart, I suppose. And without creating like literally a heart-shaped silhouette, the jar represents that. It's an idea that you have a memory of a place that's very potent, powerful, and special to you, and that we keep these things close to us, and they enrich us somehow. And that because of our function of memory, we can go back to those landscapes or back to that nature, take it out, look at it, love it as much as we would have done if we were really there. I think that, to me, that this particular work is not just clever, it's also very, very meaningful. And of course, the same quality continues in Proietti's work. And if we look again at Relander's diffusing head going into that natural form, again, this idea that we are not separate from nature, that we are nature. Very powerful stuff. And so if we were in school, I'd be showing you how I would do this. Of course, if we were in school, we'd have a lot more access to traditional methods of doing this because we would be in the darkroom as well. So for me, I was working purely digitally. And as usual, I want to remind you, I didn't use Photoshop or anything fancy, so you can absolutely definitely do this yourselves at home. I am using PowerPoint only to manipulate my images. And also I have an example where I used Image Blender on my iPhone. So here are my basic images. You can see my studio space, which is my unpainted wall in my newly built kitchen. You can also see my laundry hanging on the line in my garden, and the two images I created in those spaces. So I have a self-portrait image where I am in profile to the camera, and I have a photograph where I filled the frame entirely with the Pittosporum in the garden. Now, those are the two images that I'm going to play with. And here we go. So what I did, this is only using PowerPoint. I took my foliage, the leaves, and I reduced their saturation. I took out the colour. So I also raised my brightness and I reduced my contrast very slightly, so the tones in that image are very, very soft. There are very soft tonal transitions. With my portrait, what I did was, I was shooting against a very plain background, a white background. If that's not possible for you, of course, you can use the format tool of remove background on PowerPoint to just isolate the shape of the face or the head. And then, again, using Photoshop, I simply put one image on top of the other and then changed the transparency. So I made my face transparent. Then what I did was I saved the image as a JPEG. So I compressed the image. So this is now where two images are together. And then in Photoshop, I reinserted the image and I removed the background. So I was left with the overlapped or double exposed leaves and my portrait. At that point, what I did was I went back into colour and I looked at the saturation and I looked also at colour temperature, because I wanted to remember that those leaves are green, and I picked out lots of greens and blues. And with that then I thought about my gradient stops and my levels and my background, and I just inserted a background, a colour background, all on PowerPoint. Really super simple. Now I think for you are already using PowerPoint very effectively to do this. I know some of you are working with older versions of Photoshop elements. You don't need fancy software to do this. Now the other way of manually doing this, if you have a printer, so if you take your photograph of your plant or your natural form and you take a photograph of the portrait, you choose one that is going to overlay the other, and you would print it. If you have a printer or access to a printer at home and some tracing paper, you can print one of your images onto tracing paper and then simply stick them together. So that's a really lo-fi, manual, crafty way of doing this as well. The example I'm using from Image Blender on my iPhone is this one. So I was thinking back to how Relander, and for you for Stretch and Challenge, of course, was diffusing the portrait into the forms of the tree, the leaves. Now, this is a really rudimentary version, and I want to stress to you that this is difficult, actually. To get that detail is very difficult. And I was using a tool that is quite basic. I mean, it will give you an effect, but I think to scrutinise this image too much and to suggest it is as good as the things that Relander produces is not true. So it's a very basic version of it, but nonetheless, it is starting to do that thing. So again, I removed my background and I put my two images together on Image Blender, all on my iPhone. And then I took away the majority of the background. So I had two images that are layered. I isolated certain elements of it. I put it onto a background. That is it. It's so simple. And yet again, we're looking at something that's really effective and in context of our theme can be really, really meaningful. I've written here that Relander creates staggered space to go between human and nature forms. Now, why would we do that? Why would we go between human and nature forms? Again, we come back to this sense that we are not separate. We're not actually separate from nature. We are part of it, and it is part of us. We are inextricably linked, and more than that, we're actually the same thing. I think if we as humans realise that and start to think about that more sensitively and with greater awareness, I hope we would treat our planet and nature with much greater kindness than we currently do. So, to recap, your task: create a series of digital double exposures using portrait photographs overlaid with images of nature. You're going to analyse the work of Christoffer Relander, comparing his work to that of Tomasso, Victoria Stoponi and Alicia Brodovic, and you're going to present your work as a PowerPoint to me. So you can email it to me or you can put it on our Teams page, including your initial shots. So that would be the really kind of terrible candid shots of where your studio is and where the nature scene is that you've shot. I want you to include your initial shots. So for me, that's just my basic portrait and the picture of the Petasporum, of the leaves. And then, of course, you have your outcomes. Can I remind you that where I'm asking you to make a series is not just one image. I want you to create a series, meaning 3 or more images in this style. Now, I know Stretch and Challenge, that is really for most of you, you're going to want to experiment beyond simply containing that nature form within the silhouetted shape of the figure or the face. And you are going to want to have a look at that Relander-esque style of diffusing the human, merging the human, pushing the human form through into the nature form. And you can do that, yes, on PowerPoint again with the tool in Format, which is Remove Background, selecting smaller areas and cropping in, for example. Or you can use things on your phones. If you're using Android, that would be Vignette. If you're using iPhone, it's called Image Blender. I think it costs $3.99. If you want to have a go on Photoshop, you're looking for commands that are anything to do with double exposure is going to be about blending or overlay. If you want some extra help with that, my recommendation is actually to look at Michael Tierney on YouTube. He's got brilliant tutorials of how to use Lightroom Photoshop to create double exposures. Really, really quick and simple. I think the longest tutorial is like 3 minutes or something. He just goes through it. It's so straightforward. All of you can do it if you have access to that software at home. And as usual, I'm going to wish you good luck, and I look forward to seeing what you produce.